"Effective immediately," Brandon declared, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "You no longer belong here, Ethan Cross." My name is Ethan Cross. I'm 41 years old, and for 19 years I had been the architect of everything that mattered at Stratacore Corporation. Now, in front of 200 employees, the CEO's son was attempting to erase me with a single sentence. The microphone crackled and the sound jolted the auditorium into silence. 200 employees froze in their seats as Brandon Mercer's voice echoed across the polished floors and steel beams of Stratacore's headquarters. I stood quietly near the presentation screen, hands clasped behind my back, watching the faces in the crowd. Some shocked, some nervous, a few trying to hide knowing smirks. For 19 years, I had been the architect of Stratacore's lifeline system, the neural network that processed contracts, secured transactions, and kept billions flowing across global markets. I had written its first lines of code when the company operated from a cramped warehouse with second-hand servers and dreams bigger than its budget. But there was something Brandon didn't know. Something Richard Mercer, his father and CEO, had never suspected in all these years of walking past me in corridors, of taking credit for my innovations in board meetings, of treating me like expensive furniture. I wasn't just an employee, I was an investor, a founding investor. Back when Stratacore was nothing more than ambition stitched together with determination and caffeine, I had taken my modest savings, every dollar I could scrape together as a young engineer fresh out of MIT, and bought a small percentage of the fledgling company. 3% of nothing, Richard had laughed at the time, a tiny stake that he had barely noticed among the larger investments from venture capital firms and wealthy angels. Over the years, as the company grew and split and merged, as it acquired smaller firms and spun off subsidiaries, I had quietly maintained and expanded that position through shell companies and investment trusts. While Richard and Brandon saw me as their indispensable but invisible technical lead, I had been playing a longer game entirely. They thought they owned me. In reality, I owned a piece of them, a piece that had grown considerably larger than they knew. Brandon's smirk widened as he savored what he believed was his moment of triumph. The heir apparent, finally asserting his authority over the man whose competence had always made him look inadequate by comparison. This company will move forward without dead weight. The irony was delicious. Dead weight. The man responsible for every major system that kept their billion-dollar enterprise running was being dismissed as dead weight by someone who couldn't code his way out of a basic script. I looked out at the crowd, at Maria Santos, my senior engineer, whose dark eyes were wide with disbelief as she gripped the arms of her chair, at David Chen, the brilliant young developer I'd been mentoring for 2 years, whose hands were clenched into fists, at Jennifer Walsh from the security team whose jaw had literally dropped, at Tom Rodriguez from analytics who was shaking his head in obvious disgust, at the dozens of technical staff who had worked under my guidance, who understood what I had built and what really held this place together. They knew the truth that the Mercers had never bothered to learn. Without me, Stratacore didn't just lose an employee. It lost its heartbeat. Then I smiled, not the broken expression of a dismissed employee, but something else entirely. Something that made several people in the front row shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Is that so?" I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the silent auditorium despite its conversational tone. "Well then, good luck with that." The confidence in my tone seemed to unsettle Brandon for a moment. He had clearly expected pleading or anger or at least some kind of fight. Instead, he got calm amusement, as if I knew something he didn't. Which, of course, I did. "Security will escort you out," he added, trying to regain his theatrical momentum. I nodded once, straightened my jacket, and began walking toward the glass doors at the back of the auditorium. As I passed Maria's row, I caught her eye and gave the slightest nod. A gesture so small that only someone who had worked closely with me for years would recognize it. She understood. David saw it too. They all did. The moment I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, feeling the weight of 19 years lifting from my shoulders, I pulled out my phone and began making calls. The first went to James Harrison, a fund manager whose career I had quietly helped resurrect 3 years ago when a bad tech investment had nearly destroyed his reputation. "James," I said simply when he answered. "It's Ethan. I need you to sell your Stratacore position when the market opens." "All of it." "Ethan? I thought you were at the company presentation this morning." "Wait, sell? But your guidance has always been solid on Stratacore." "What's changed?" "Everything. Trust me on this one." There's going to be a storm, and you don't want to be caught in it. There was a pause. James had learned over the years that when Ethan Cross called with investment advice, you listened. How big a storm are we talking about? The kind that sinks ships. The second call went to Patricia Wong, whose pension fund held significant Stratacor stock. The third to Marcus Rodriguez, who controlled a major institutional investment portfolio. The fourth to Sarah Kim, whose hedge fund had made enormous profits following my previous recommendations. Each conversation was brief, professional, and carried the weight of years of built trust and proven results. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were people whose success had been built in part on listening when I spoke. People who had learned that Ethan Cross didn't make casual recommendations. Sell everything today, before noon if possible. By the time I reached my car in the executive parking garage, a privilege I had earned but would no longer need, I had contacted 16 major shareholders. Investors who controlled, collectively, nearly 30% of Stratacor's outstanding shares. Back inside the building, the first signs of trouble were already emerging. Maria stared at her monitor, watching as transaction queues began to slow. Error messages that had never appeared before started popping up in system logs. David refreshed his dashboard repeatedly, confusion creasing his brow as system responses grew sluggish and then stopped altogether. "Something's wrong with the lifeline," Maria whispered to the engineer beside her, keeping her voice low enough that the managers wouldn't overhear. But it wasn't wrong. It was working exactly as designed. Working for its true architect. The system I had built over 19 years wasn't just code. It was an extension of my understanding of the business, my knowledge of its patterns, my fingerprints on every critical process. I had designed it with layers of security and authentication that went far beyond standard protocols. The Lifeline system had always been more than a transaction processor. It was a living thing in its way, designed to protect not just data, but the integrity of the work itself. And when its creator, the man whose biometric signatures were woven into its deepest security layers, walked out those doors, the system began its own quiet rebellion. Authentication failures cascaded through the network. Processes that had run smoothly for years suddenly required approvals that no longer existed. The Lifeline didn't crash. That would have been crude, obvious. Instead, it became gradually, systematically uncooperative. At 9:30 a.m., when the markets opened, Stratacor's stock price began its descent. Richard Mercer was in his corner office, reviewing quarterly projections and basking in what he thought was his son's successful assertion of authority, when his assistant burst through the door without knocking. "Sir, you need to see this, right now." The financial news networks were already picking up the story. "Unusual selling pressure on Stratacor Corporation," the anchor was saying as charts showed the stock price dropping in real time. "Volume is extremely high for this time of morning." Richard's phone rang, then rang again, and again. "What do you mean you're selling?" He barked into the receiver at Harrison. "James, we've been partners for 15 years. But Harrison's voice was calm, decisive, tinged with the confidence of a man following advice from someone he trusted completely. "Sorry, Richard. Got a tip from someone whose judgment I've learned to respect. Market's about to turn ugly for you." "A tip? From who?" "Someone who knows your business better than you do, apparently." Similar conversations were happening across the financial district. Major shareholders, spooked by urgent warnings from their most reliable source, were dumping their positions with an efficiency that spoke to years of trust and proven results. The sell-off created its own momentum, triggering algorithmic trading systems and stop losses as the stock price fell through support level after support level. By 10 a.m., Stratacor had lost 20% of its value. By 10:15, trading had been halted twice due to volatility. By 10:30, the Lifeline system had gone into what appeared to be a cascading failure mode, with critical processes grinding to a halt across the entire enterprise. Brandon stormed into the technical floor, his earlier confidence replaced by panic and a sheen of sweat across his forehead. "Fix it!" he shouted at the assembled engineers, his voice cracking with stress. "Whatever's wrong with the system, fix it now." Maria looked up from her workstation, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with understanding. "We're trying, sir, but the system seems to be rejecting all administrative overrides." "That's impossible." "I have full administrative access!" David, barely containing his emotion and the urge to say what everyone was thinking, spoke up with deliberate calm. The Lifeline was designed with unique security protocols, multi-layered authentication systems, Only the original architect has full system privileges. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Brandon's face flushed red, the color creeping up from his collar. He sabotaged it! That bastard sabotaged us before he left. But Maria shook her head, her voice steady and professional. No, sir, the system is functioning exactly as designed. It's designed to protect itself and the integrity of the data and us. Jennifer Walsh from security, who had been monitoring the system failures, added quietly, "The authentication logs show no unauthorized access, no code changes, no sabotage. The system is simply refusing to accept certain commands." Commands from who? From anyone who isn't Ethan Cross. As word spread through the building about both the technical crisis and the stock collapse, something unexpected began to happen. Employees started talking, quietly at first, in hushed conversations by the coffee machines and in empty conference rooms, then more openly as the magnitude of the situation became clear. "Ethan saw this coming," someone whispered in the break room. "He tried to warn them about the infrastructure vulnerabilities last month," another added. Brandon told him to stop being so negative. 20% in 2 hours. Jesus Christ, my retirement fund? You think he planned this? I think he's been planning this for years. The conversations weren't just technical staff anymore. Accountants, sales managers, even some of the executives were beginning to realize that the quiet man they had all taken for granted might have been the most important person in the building. Richard Mercer found himself in the unprecedented position of begging shareholders not to sell, even as his own company's systems failed around him and his son ran around the building like a headless chicken, accomplishing nothing but spreading more panic. The irony was bitter. The man who had built their technological foundation was gone, and with him, their ability to function in the modern economy. By noon, I was back. Not as a terminated employee seeking reinstatement, but as something else entirely. I walked through those same glass doors, but this time I was accompanied by 3 people. Catherine Hartwell from Hartwell and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious corporate law firms. Michael Torres, a forensic accountant whose reputation for uncovering financial irregularities was legendary. And Jennifer Kim, a business journalist from the Financial Times whose presence suggested that this story was about to become very public. The building felt different. Where there had been the usual hum of productivity and quiet efficiency, now there was an undercurrent of anxiety, whispered conversations stopping abruptly when managers walked by, and the constant buzz of phones as people tried to manage an unmanageable crisis. I found Richard in the main boardroom, surrounded by charts showing their stock price in freefall, system diagnostics that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all he understood them, and a conference table full of panicked executives who looked like they were watching their careers implode in real time. He looked up as I entered, his face cycling through surprise, anger, hope, and something that might have been resignation. The other executives fell silent, staring at me like I was either their salvation or the architect of their destruction. Both, as it turned out, were true. "Ethan," Richard began, his voice hoarse from 2 hours of shouting into phones, but I held up a hand. "Richard, Brandon." I nodded to each of them, my voice calm and professional. "Gentlemen, I think we need to talk." My lawyer, Catherine Hartwell, placed a thick folder on the conference table with the kind of precise movement that suggested its contents were going to change everything. "Mr. Cross would like to discuss the future of Stratacore Corporation." Brandon leaned forward aggressively, his earlier panic morphing into familiar arrogance. "You can't just waltz back in here after sabotaging our entire infrastructure and—" "Mr. Mercer," Catherine interrupted smoothly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from winning cases against much larger opponents. "I'd strongly recommend you review the documents before making any accusations you might later regret." Richard opened the folder with trembling hands, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. His face went pale as he read the first page, then paler as he continued to the second. When he spoke, his voice came out as barely a whisper. "You own 14% of the company." I nodded, settling into a chair across from him. "I was one of your first investors, Richard. Back when Stratacore was nothing but potential and caffeine. You remember 3% of nothing, you called it. Over the years, through various acquisitions, stock splits, and careful market movements, that position has grown considerably. But 14% isn't controlling interest," Brandon sputtered, grasping for any foothold in a conversation that was clearly spiraling beyond his control. Catherine smiled, the expression of a chess player who had been thinking several moves ahead for quite some time. Perhaps not, but combined with the positions of Mr. Cross's associates, who have been acquiring shares at today's rather attractive prices. She placed another document on the table. A list of shareholders who had been buying even as others sold in panic. Investors who trusted my judgment more than they feared market volatility, who had seen the stock price crash as an opportunity rather than a crisis. 42%, Richard read aloud, his voice hollow. Enough to call for new board elections, I confirmed. Enough to demand changes in leadership. Enough to fundamentally restructure how this company operates. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of chaos from the trading floor, where Stratacor's stock continued its descent and where employees were discovering just how much of their daily work depended on systems that no longer wanted to cooperate. "What do you want?" Richard asked finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had just realized that his understanding of his own company had been fundamentally flawed for 19 years. I looked around the boardroom, at the portraits of past leaders, at the view of the city beyond the windows, at the empire I had helped build, and that had nearly discarded me like used equipment. "I want Stratacor to become what it was always meant to be," I said, my voice steady and clear. "A company that values innovation over inheritance, merit over nepotism, the people who actually build things over the people who just happen to inherit them." Brandon's face was crimson, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. "This is extortion!" This is business," I replied calmly, cutting him off. "This is what happens when you mistake luck for skill, when you confuse inheritance with achievement." I turned to the window, watching the financial district below, where my former colleagues' hard work was being traded and valued by people who had never written a line of code or solved a complex technical problem, or stayed up all night debugging a system that millions of people depended on. "You have a choice, gentlemen. You can fight this, drag it through courts and boardrooms while your company bleeds talent and money and reputation. Or you can accept that Stratacor needs new leadership." I turned back to face them, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Leadership that understands that a company's true value isn't in its stock price or its brand name or its fancy offices. It's in the people who get up every morning and build something meaningful. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, I could see Maria and David at their workstations, along with dozens of other engineers and developers and analysts who had made Stratacor what it was. They weren't looking at their screens anymore, screens that were displaying error messages and system failures. They were looking at us. Those people, I continued, have been carrying this company on their backs while being treated like interchangeable parts. They deserve better. Richard followed my gaze, then looked down at the documents that had just rewritten his understanding of his own company, his own position, his own future. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "what happens to the system? What happens to our stock price?" I smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I had shown since walking back into the building. "The Lifeline will resume normal operations within the hour, and I suspect the market will respond very favorably to news of Stratacor's commitment to technical excellence and responsible leadership transition." Because that was the other call I had made that morning, after arranging the coordinated sell-off. To Sarah Chen at the Financial Times, a reporter who had been covering the tech industry for 2 decades, and who understood the difference between genuine innovation and corporate theater. The story was already being written. Stratacor's technical architect returns. A case study in corporate governance and leadership accountability. Brandon stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone in the room wince. "I won't be part of this. This is my company, my birthright." I looked at him with something approaching sympathy, though not much. "No, Brandon, you just worked here. You never understood the difference between owning something and building it, between inheriting authority and earning respect." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the glass walls. Richard watched his son leave, his expression unreadable, then looked back at me with tired eyes that seemed to age in real time. 19 years, he said quietly. 19 years you were right here, building everything we depended on, and I never really saw you." "You saw what you chose to see," I replied, not unkindly. "But it's not too late to choose differently." An hour later, as promised, the Lifeline system hummed back to life. Transactions that had been frozen began processing with their usual efficiency. Error messages disappeared from screens across the building. The digital heartbeat of Stratacor resumed its steady, reliable rhythm. And in offices and trading floors across the financial district, people began to notice that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than a simple technical glitch in market volatility. 3 months later, I stood in the same auditorium where Brandon had attempted to dismiss me. But this time, I was the one at the podium, addressing the company as its new Chief Technology Officer, Chief Innovation Officer, and largest individual shareholder. The transformation had been swift but thorough. Maria sat in the front row, now Director of System Architecture, her salary doubled and her authority finally matching her expertise. David was beside her, promoted to Senior Developer and already leading a team working on the next generation of Lifeline improvements. The rest of the technical team filled the first several rows, no longer invisible in their own company, no longer treated as expensive but replaceable equipment. Stratacore has always been about connections, I began, looking out at the faces, some familiar, some new, all focused on what came next rather than what had been lost. Connections between markets, between people, between ideas and execution. I paused, remembering another presentation in this same room when I had been dismissed as irrelevant by someone who had never built anything in his life. But the most important connection is the one between a company and the people who believe in its mission enough to dedicate their careers, their creativity, their best years to making it succeed. Today we're recommitting to that connection. The applause that followed wasn't polite corporate clapping. It was genuine, enthusiastic, and came from people who finally felt heard, valued, and respected in their own workplace. After the presentation, as the auditorium slowly emptied and people gathered in small groups to discuss the new initiatives I had announced, Maria approached me. "So what's next?" she asked, and I could hear in her voice the confidence of someone who finally believed her opinions mattered. I looked around the space, at the screens now displaying healthy system metrics, at the employees chatting excitedly about new projects and possibilities, at the foundation we had built and rebuilt and were building again, stronger this time. "Now we get back to work," I said, "and we build something that lasts. Because that's what architects do. We design structures that can weather storms, that serve their purpose long after we're gone, that grow stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Sometimes that means starting from scratch. Sometimes it means knowing when to tear down what doesn't serve the mission and rebuild from a stronger foundation. And sometimes it means understanding that the most powerful move isn't walking away. It's coming back when you're truly needed, with the tools and the support and the authority to make lasting change." The Lifeline system continued to hum quietly in the background, processing thousands of transactions every minute, connecting markets and people and possibilities across the globe. But for the first time in 19 years, it felt like it was serving something bigger than just profit margins and quarterly reports. It was serving a vision of what a company could be when it valued the people who built it as much as the profits they generated. Brandon never returned to Stratacore. Last I heard, he was working for a smaller competitor, learning, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it meant to earn his position rather than inherit it. The experience was reportedly humbling. Richard stayed on as chairman emeritus, focusing on strategic partnerships and external relations while letting people who understood technology make the technical decisions. It was a role that suited him better than he had expected, and he seemed genuinely relieved to be free of the daily operational pressures he had never fully grasped. And the 14% that had started it all? It grew into something much more valuable than a stock position. It became proof that sometimes the most patient investment is in yourself, in your own worth, your own vision, and your own ability to build something that matters more than money. The markets eventually rewarded that patience. Stratacore's stock not only recovered, but reached new highs as investors recognized the value of competent technical leadership and sustainable innovation practices. But more importantly, so did the people whose careers and livelihoods depended on having leaders who understood the difference between owning something and actually caring for it. In the end, the greatest return on investment wasn't financial. It was walking into work each morning knowing that the systems I built, the team I developed, and the company I helped save would continue creating value long after the stock prices and quarterly reports were forgotten. That's what real architecture is about. Building things that last, building things that serve, building things that connect people to possibilities they hadn't imagined. And sometimes, if you're very patient and very careful and very certain of your own worth, building the foundation for a future where merit matters more than inheritance, where innovation matters more than tradition, and where the people who actually build the future have a voice in shaping it. The Lifeline continues to run, processing billions of dollars in transactions every day, connecting markets and minds across the global economy. But now it serves a company that understands its true value isn't just in the code, but in the hands that wrote it and the minds that continue to improve it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's construction. Building something better, building something that lasts, building something worthy of the investment, not just financial but human, that went into creating it. And in the quiet hours after the markets close and the building empties, when the lifeline system processes its final transactions of the day and prepares for tomorrow's challenges, I sometimes think I can hear something in its electronic rhythm. Not just the pulse of commerce and connection, but something deeper. The heartbeat of an idea made real. The rhythm of work that matters. The steady, reliable sound of a foundation built to last. Built by people who understand that true value comes not from what you inherit, but from what you create. That's the sound of true architecture. And it's been worth every moment of the 19-year wait. Sometimes the greatest power comes not from what you say, but from what you've quietly built while others weren't paying attention. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Have you ever found strength in being underestimated?
Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy behind you, I don't need what's left undone. Sometimes losing who once broke you is how healing has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone again. Some days feel off, like I'm standing but still falling. A little pain, a little tired, and no one to tell it all to. There are days that feel unsteady, like I'm drifting out of place. Every step just feels so heavy, with a smile I have to fake. A little hurt I keep inside me, a little weight I always hide, and 1,000 quiet worries I've been holding deep inside. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I keep walking through the silence like it's all I've ever known. Every crowded room reminds me how it feels to be alone. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Maybe one day I'll be stronger, maybe I'll learn how to speak, but for now I keep it buried in the parts of me too weak. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you.